So growing up, my father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they will often ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist. So, as you might expect, when I became a young adult, I ricocheted off into extreme feminism.
You know, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, it's the other way around. We heal from the sticks and the stones, right? But eventually, it's those labels that can last for decades of time.
And so when I was in high school, I started asking questions about my faith. Like, How do we know it's true? I'm attending a public high school. All my textbooks are secular. All my teachers are secular. And I just started asking, how do we know that this is really true? I had a chance to talk to a university professor, and I asked him point blank, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me.
You know, from Genesis 3, from the fall, God has from that point forward has been about restoration.
And then I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes. And so eventually I decided, I guess Christianity just doesn't have any answers. In other words, here's what I thought. As a 16-year-old, if all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of time and space, what makes me think I could have access to any sort of transcendent, objective, universal truth?
We need to understand that young people going through genuine either gender dysphoria or same-sex attraction or something that doesn't feel like it conforms or fits in are really experiencing incredible and pretty intense ongoing chronic emotional pain.
It's because I was in Europe then that I kind of stumbled across the ministry of Francis Schaeffer, which was in Switzerland, called L'Abri. And Schaeffer was known for his apologetics, so this was the first time I encountered any sort of apologetics. I did become a Christian and had to start over.
Welcome to the Love and Truth Network podcast, your guide for hope and healing in a hurting world searching for truth. Here we explore God's extraordinary design for biblical sexuality, identity, and authentic community. You'll be impacted by incredible stories of transformation, practical wisdom from pastors and counselors, and the power of God's grace that changes lives. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Love and Truth Network podcast. We're glad that you're here with us today. We have a treat for you. I have for quite some time been looking forward to having Professor Nancy Pearcey here with us for one of our podcasts. I was absolutely thrilled a number of episodes ago. Actually, for our 100th episode, we had Rosaria Butterfield join us for that. And I've also been, ever since then, have been thinking it would be wonderful to have Nancy Pearcey on our podcast. And Nancy and I actually were doing an event together in Portland and Oregon and earlier this year. And I thought, well, there's no better time than to ask her in person if she'd possibly join us. And so here she is today. And we're excited, Professor Pearcey, for you to be with us.
Oh, thank you so much. It was good meeting you in Portland, and I'm glad that we can have this follow-up interview.
Well, and you're a professor and scholar in residence at, it used to be Houston Baptist University, now Houston Christian University, I believe, right?
Right.
Okay, and how many years have you been there, by the way?
Oh my, about 12 years.
Okay, and prior to that?
I worked for Prison Fellowship, which is an international prison ministry. I was there for almost a decade, and I was brought on board to be the editor of Breakpoint, which is a radio program, which you may know, your listeners may know, Breakpoint. So I was the one who started Breakpoint for Chuck Colson and built up the program, hired writers, set out the agenda of what we were going to cover. So it was quite a project, and that's where I really learned how to write. If you write for the spoken word, that's how you really learn how to write.
Yes. That's amazing. I mean, I didn't understand or know a lot about your background until we were just sitting together over lunch and we were talking, and you have an amazing and full background in terms of just the different things you've done in Christian education. And I say Christian education, maybe not, well, it's certainly what you're doing now, but even with Breakpoint and the ways that you've ministered in the Christian community. But interestingly, and I may have this wrong, but I think at one time you at least would have identified as agnostic, but I think maybe even atheist at one point.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. Well, let me put it this way. I was raised in a Lutheran home, and I don't know if you realize this, but all Scandinavians are Lutheran. So
Okay.
my parents were Scandinavian. So it really was more of an ethnic background. And so when I was in high school, I started asking questions about my faith. Like,
Yes.
how do we know it's true? I'm attending a public high school. All my textbooks are secular. All my teachers are secular. And I just started asking, how do we know that this is really true? And unfortunately, my parents could not answer that. I had a chance to talk to a university professor. And I asked him point blank, why are you a Christian? He said, works for me.
Oh.
I said, that's it? And then I had a chance to talk to a seminary dean, and all he said was, don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes. And so eventually I decided, I guess Christianity just doesn't have any answers. And I felt it was a matter of intellectual honesty to put it aside, to say, okay, if I don't have good reasons for something, I shouldn't say I believe it, whether it's Christianity or anything. And so I very consciously, very intentionally set aside my Christian upbringing about halfway through high school and decided it was up to me to find out what was truth. And so I literally started going down to the library in the public high school I attended and pulling books off the philosophy shelf. Because I thought, if I can't find any people to talk to me about these things, isn't that the philosopher's job, right? To answer questions like, well, what is truth? How do we know it? Is there a foundation for ethics? Or is it just true for me, true for you? Is there meaning to life? And I pretty quickly realized if there was no God, the answer was no. No meaning to life, no foundation for ethics, even no foundation for truth. In other words, here's what I thought as a 16-year-old.
Yes.
If all I have is my puny brain and the vast scope of time and space, what makes me think I could have access to any sort of transcendent, objective, universal truth? Ridiculous. So I became a skeptic and a relativist and adopted all of these secularisms, even determinism, because in my science classes I was taught we were just complex biochemical machines with no free will. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had absorbed all of these secular isms. And it was several years later, I was in Germany. We had lived in Germany when I was a child. And so I had saved my money all through high school because I wanted to go back. But it's because I was in Europe then that I kind of stumbled across the ministry of Francis Schaeffer, which was in Switzerland, called L'Abri. L'Abri is French for the shelter. And Schaeffer was known for his apologetics. So this was the first time I encountered any sort of apologetics.
Yes.
And I was blown away. I had no idea Christianity could be supported with good reasons and arguments, and that it could stand up against the secularisms that I had absorbed by that time. So I had all these, very, very rigorous discussions at the time. And I have to tell you, I did not become a Christian right away. I left. After a month, I left. Because I was afraid I might be drawn in emotionally. Because L'Abri was so appealing. Intellectual Christians, culture. Schaeffer was also known for doing what's called cultural apologetics. In other words, he didn't just look at apologetics as, so many arguments in the logical ether. He looked at how do ideas percolate down through cultural forms like art and music and movies, literature, even advertisements. They all express a worldview. Yes. And so this was very appealing to me, and I was afraid I would be drawn in. And Christianity had let me down once before, so I was not going to take this step unless I was intellectually convinced it was true. So I left L'Abri, went back to the States, but through reading, through L'Abri, I discovered there was apologetics. I discovered people like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton. Os Guinness was at L'Abri when I was there, had written his first book. So all that to say, just through my own reading, I eventually decided I was convinced it was true. And so,
and you became convinced in the States?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did. But, yes, it says, after I came home, as a friend of mine once put it, I read my way back to God. And then I thought, well, where do I find other Christians? Because I wasn't in a church or anything. I thought, well, I knew some at L'Abri. So a year and a half later, I went back. That's how long it took.
Okay.
And that's when I got really grounded, in Christian worldview and so on. And that explains why all my writing, all my teaching is on apologetics, because it was such a big part of my own conversion. I just have a real heart for young people who have the kind of questions that I had when I was young.
Right. And then you add all the stuff, since then that has been added to the cultural template and in all the big questions about identity and sexuality and a number of things. But those are big ones. Of course, sexuality has always been a part of the conversation or questions, but identity in some ways, I think is, and this is jumping forward, I want to go back, but I think identity in some ways is new in the magnitude and the kind of the global confusion around so much of it. I think in some ways, there's nothing new under the sun. I mean, Solomon says that. I agree with that. But there is something kind of new in the level and the magnitude of brokenness around our sense of identity as ones who have been made in the image of God, male and female.
Yeah, a lot of it has to do, surprisingly, with the theory of Darwinian evolution. Because what is the heart of evolution? What is the heart of evolutionary advance? It's differential reproduction. That is, whoever has the most offspring wins. And so the whole system is designed around reproduction. And so even Foucault says this, the French writer on sexuality who's so famous. Foucault said it's because of Darwin that sexuality moved from being just part of our identity, it's part of life, obviously, and an important part. But Foucault says that's when it became central to our identity. Before that, sexuality was just one part. Now it became central. It became what we do, who we are, our full identity. I'm trying to think of his exact words. I have his exact words in my book, Love Thy Body. But he literally says something like, sex is like the core of who we are. Sex is worth dying for. His exact words, which he then did, as you may know. He died of AIDS. But he literally said, it's the heart of who we are, and it's worth dying for. So that's, surprisingly enough, the reason sexuality became central to our identity was because of an evolutionary view of the human person as just a biological organism, and that evolution advances through reproduction. It's at the heart of what makes the theory work.
Yes. And so I want to talk about that more, but I also want to jump back a little bit in terms of how old were you when you went back to L'Abri the second time?
Oh, when I was there the first time, I was the youngest person there.
No. Okay.
I was 18 still. And so I went back a year and a half later.
Okay.
So I was still pretty young.
Yep. And you were there for several years?
No. People wonder why this is, but most people went to L'Abri for 3 months. The reason is, in most European countries, you can get a 3-month tourist visa.
My son is exploring Europe right now, and he's like, I can only go for 90 days. Yes,
exactly. And so it's just a little less than a semester. So for many people, they came to L'Abri for basically a semester. The second time I was there, I stayed 4 months. I got an extra month.
All right,
But then it was Christmas, and I decided I was strong enough to go back home. Strong enough in the sense of, now we're sort of jumping to the next book, because as you know from my book on masculinity, I grew up in a very abusive home. And so I was very scared of going home. And I decided after that much time, I was strong enough to go home and face my family life again.
Yes. Well, and that is so interesting, Nancy, as well, what you just spoke about that. I mean, so you mentioned, this is your most recent book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, which is incredibly powerful. There are so many things in there I'd love to chat with you about. But one of the things that really stood out to me is what you just said. I think it's the first book that you really put some of your own growing up experiences and the challenges that you faced. If you're willing to chat about that, I would love it. I also wonder, as I read through your book, I'm like, it makes perfect sense that this would be the book that you share some of your experiences with your father and all of that, because it destroys anyone's argument that, she just had kind of a perfect upbringing and a wonderful father that just doted and never really ran into toxic masculinity anywhere. And so therefore she's not really writing out of any kind of authentic experience. And your story, as you start off with this, obliterates that argument altogether.
Yes. And I was interviewed by a Christian psychologist once who put it this way: at least we know you're not writing from an ivory tower. You're writing from the trenches. That's
for sure. Could you share a little bit of, so in going back home, what was family life like?
So growing up, my father was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they will often ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist. In fact, his favorite was the knuckle fist with the middle finger slightly extended to cause a sharper stab of pain. So there were 6 children, and so it wasn't just me. Watching my siblings get beaten was difficult as well. And he was quite open about it. He wouldn't say, do this, I'll spank you. He'd say, do this, or I'll beat you.
Yeah.
And then he would follow through on his threats. So it was, we lived in terror. That's the best word for describing our growing up years. And when I talk to my siblings, they use the same word.
Yes.
We lived in terror. So as you might expect, when I became a young adult, I ricocheted off into extreme feminism, right? So I read all the major feminist books, Betty Friedan, Simone de Beauvoir, Kate Millett. I thought they were wonderful. I thought each one was better than the last. I was totally absorbed. But then I did become a Christian and had to start over and rethink the whole issue of masculinity and men. And you're right, it took many years. It was not an easy thing. This book, my book on masculinity, is a product of many, many years of emotional and psychological healing. In fact, one thing I was able to talk about in this book, which I have not talked about before, was that my emotional psychological healing also started at L'Abri. L'Abri was known for its apologetics. But what most people don't know is on staff was a psychiatric social worker. And she agreed to join the staff because she realized that for many people, their barriers against Christianity are not just intellectual, but are emotional.
So wise.
Yes, especially pastors' kids and missionary kids. And she was a missionary kid. So her name was Sheila Bird, and we nicknamed her Birdie. But she helped me get started. My Christian life got started with a really good balance, therefore, of side of the intellectual side, apologetics, but also the emotional, psychological side. And the one reason it was so effective is that she actually saw my dad. People ask me, why would you go to a Christian ministry if you were not a Christian? Well, I didn't go to L'Abri for L'Abri. I had no interest in going to a Christian ministry. But I had my parents were passing through Europe. My father had a job overseas, and so he was passing through Europe, and a Christian friend said to him, if you're driving through Switzerland, you should stop at this place called L'Abri. And so they were kind of touristy Christians, right? They were coming in, let's see what L'Abri's doing, in a kind of a touristy sense. And they said, why don't you come down and join us? So I went to L'Abri to see my parents. And while we were there, Schaefer used to hold lectures every Saturday night. And so we walked in, my parents and a few siblings, and Bertie looked at my father. She told me this later. Bertie looked at my father, and she said, when I looked at your father, I said to myself, this is the man who oppresses everyone around him. She could tell by just looking at him.
Wow.
And so that's why she was very prepared to help me. Once I started meeting with her and talking with her, I had suppressed it so much that I might not have even talked about it. But she was able to say, okay, let's talk about your dad. I saw something there, and I know that you need to talk about it. So it was a wonderful heritage from L'Abri, is both intellectual and the spiritual, emotional healing. Yes.
Well, and I think there's so many people who have had traumatic, ongoing, chronic experiences that are that enter the mental health field. My wife's a licensed Christian counselor, for example, but many people enter the counseling field or some kind of helping field in many ways, educationally, trying to understand themselves, trying to work something out within themselves, and oftentimes pile on more and more intellectual knowledge, but they're not dealing with the underlying issues. And there's no way of projecting forward and knowing, but I wonder, obviously God knew that you not only needed to surrender to him, and also the Christianity is built on not just some hopeful faith, but it's really built on a solid foundation that you can put your faith in, like it makes sense. But in addition to that, there's all of this trauma and junk to unpack. And for those that are watching or listening to this, it is wholly insufficient to only learn more information. That is a wonderful thing to do, but it's important that you're also working out the stuff that is, whether it's trauma or other things, that you're actually putting yourself in a place where you can do some of that as well. And honestly, that's the scarier thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Working on ideas is fun. It's not scary. Working on your inner life is scary. And it takes the whole rest of your life. Sometimes you think you go through a certain amount of healing and you think, okay, I'm done.
Yes.
Then you live a little while and there's another healing you have to do. And then there's another layer of healing you have to do. And I finally realized this never ends, to some degree. Francis Schaeffer used to even address this. He said, you're never going to get perfection this side of heaven. And if you demand perfection, it'll be, all or nothing. You'll probably end up with nothing. And so his phrase was substantial healing.
Yes.
Since God is real, we should expect substantial healing in this life, but not perfect healing.
Yeah.
And so I would say, even at my age, I still sometimes have to deal with the trauma of my childhood. And, it still causes me grief, right? The grief of having lost my childhood. The grief of seeing all of my siblings also struggle with that. And, with sometimes very overt psychopathologies in my whole family.
Sure.
And, I should mention that my father has passed away. I wouldn't have written this book until he passed away. I wouldn't have said these things publicly. But, that's why I'm free to talk about it now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one of the things, just to shift for a moment to talking about your most recent book, one of the things, well, let me back up a moment. Where I first became aware of you is when I downloaded an audiobook of Love Thy Body. And so I'd go out and I'd ride my bike for miles and miles, and I'd listen to this. And I remember thinking so many times as I'm listening, and I'm running a ministry. I've been a pastor for 12 years. I'm dealing with sexual brokenness, and I mean, ministering in the world of sexual brokenness and identity confusion and that stuff all the time. And as I'm listening to your book, I felt like there were parts of it I'm like, I feel like I've been living under a rock, even though this is the stuff that I do all the time. And so from that book, would you just kind of speak to the idea of the two-story view, that Gnostic perspective that we've really gravitated back toward with regard to abortion, with regard to doing whatever we want to with our bodies and those kind of things?
Yeah, and let me say too, that this book also grew out of my own personal experience. But unfortunately, since it involves people in my family, they don't want to go. They have not been willing to go public, or they have not wanted me to go public either.
Sure.
Which is sad, because I think when I talk to audiences, sometimes, especially young people, will come up to me and say, you would have more credibility if we knew you'd been there.
Yeah.
And so sometimes on a one-to-one level, I will say, well, actually, I have been there. Let me tell you. Now let me tell you my story. So this book also grew out of intense personal struggles. And one of the things that I realized is, we also have to come to grips with what the secular world is saying, because that influences us. Of course, we're surrounded by it. And so I started reading secular books on sexuality and abortion and so on. And what I realized is that the secular view of sexuality kind of has a two-story division. Philosophers sometimes use the metaphor of two stories in a building. The lower story is what we know by science, and that's objective and that's factual. And then the upper story is what we feel, our inner sense of self and so on. It's most obvious with transgenderism, because transgender activists argue explicitly that your authentic identity has nothing to do with your biological sex. That your inner sense of gender identity, is unrelated to whether you're actually biologically male or female. And in fact, one of the quotes that I have in my book, Love Thy Body, is, I have to read the academic literature, so you don't have to.
Yes, thank you.
And there was a Princeton University professor who wrote, I think, the first book defending transgenderism. And on one hand, she acknowledged that transgenderism involves self-division, self-alienation, self-estrangement. These were her words, because your sense of self is estranged from who you are biologically. And then she said, but this is not a problem, or in her words, this is not pathological. Why? and these are her exact words, because what the real body tells us, the physical body tells us, is nothing. It has no meaning at all. So her point was, you don't take your identity from your body. Your body is meaningless. This is what's being taught really down to kindergarten these days, that your body has no meaning at all. It gives you no sense of your identity. It gives you no moral message. It has no intrinsic purpose that we're morally obligated to respect. It has no meaning at all. And so as a result, young people today are being taught to disregard their body and to have a low view. This is the surprising thing, because usually Christians are accused of having a low view of the body, right? And of sexuality and so on. And it's actually the reverse today. Christianity has a much higher view of the physical body than the secular world does, which says your body is meaningless. It's a product of mindless material forces and has no particular meaning in itself. And so we can contradict it. We can override it. Our gender identity can be in opposition to. There's a BBC documentary that said the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. And in that war, the mind wins. The body doesn't count. So that's kind of the core of Love Thy Body. That's the title, is that, as Christians, we have a much, much higher view of the body as, the creation of a loving God who does have a purpose for us in creating us male and female. And so, the high view of the body is what I am trying to get Christians to sort of recover through that book.
Yeah. And is it Peter Singer? I'm probably getting the name wrong, but an ethicist at, is it Princeton University? And I was shocked again in listening to your book a number of years ago now, just the perspective that I think he's even made the argument, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe others have too, that the idea of personhood and the idea that yes, this is part of what's happening in our culture now, is people are saying, well, yes, it's human. An embryo, a preborn baby is human from the time of conception. I mean, we know that that's true, but it doesn't have value or personhood until a certain point. And he's even arguing, if I'm not mistaken, that could possibly be many years after birth that a child begins to actually have personhood and value as something inherently purposeful to protect and well, just that, protect. What? Correct me if I'm wrong on those things.
You're right, except that it was 3 years. 3 years of age, he said, is still a gray area on whether a toddler is a person or not. Yet this two-story split view of the human being first became evident in abortion. And so what happened is people who support abortion lost the argument on the scientific level, right? Because it's just too obvious that from DNA, from genetics, from science, the fetus is human from conception. In fact, today you will not find a single bioethicist who denies that the fetus is human from conception. So how do they get around that scientific fact if they want to support abortion? Well, that's when they created that split. They said, well, the fetus is human, but it's not a person. And personhood, it's actually called personhood theory. Personhood was said to rest on certain mental abilities, cognitive functioning, self-awareness, self-determination, ability to make decisions, even, sense of the future, depending on which bioethicist you talk to. And of course, that's part of the problem is once personhood is separated from biology, then how do you define it? How developed do these abilities need to be? And every secular bioethicist draws the line at a different place. So it's become completely subjective, completely arbitrary. And you're right, probably the majority of ordinary people still think the fetus becomes a person sometime before birth. But there are bioethicists who say no. In fact, the two scientists who discovered DNA, Crick and Watson, who are kind of household names now, Crick and Watson have both said parents should have 3 days of genetic testing of their baby because some genetic defects don't show up until after birth. And so the parent should still have the right to kill the baby after birth. And then the most notorious one is the one you mentioned, Peter Singer, a bioethicist at Princeton, who said 3 years of age is still a gray area. Because after all, how much cognitive functioning does a toddler have? And so this is where the two-story division of the human being first took root, is in the question of abortion. Because people began to say you can be human but not a person. And you realize what that means is it totally undermines any sense of human rights. Now, they're acknowledging you can be a human, but not have human rights.
Yes.
So it actually affects all other issues of human rights as well.
Yeah.
So the two-story division of the human being is something that Christians need to be aware of. And we need to come back at that with a biblical view that, no, God created us as a physical, emotional, spiritual being, that
Yes.
we're unity all through, and that our body has the dignity and value of being part of who we are, and intrinsic to who we are and to our identity.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating too that from a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, that like our bodies have so much meaning that one day they're going to be resurrected again. I mean, why would God even do that? If our bodies didn't have meaning, and of course our bodies tell the story about who we are 100 years after we die. I mean, people, we can tell whether it's male, whether someone's male or female, et cetera, through testing. But that idea that we're going to be resurrected again, our bodies are going to be raised to glorified bodies, but utilizing that original framework of some kind. I understand whether it's through cremation or other things, but somehow God is going to resurrect our actual bodies to glorify bodies. But another thing too, as you're talking, Nancy, I'm just thinking about the way that so many Christians, and I've been here too in this in the past, I sometimes stumble into it again, is trying to understand a person's worldview apart from any kind of really Christian framework or some kind of amalgamation of all of it, that Christian, but everything else too. The idea that I think we try to understand what you just described and wonder, how could somebody actually think that? How could somebody think that our bodies, a boy can become a girl can become a boy, those kinds of things. How can somebody actually think that? But when you start recognizing what you said earlier, that it really does all go back to Darwinian theory and to evolution and the idea that there is no God. I mean, it really does go back to some of those basic frameworks.
Yes, let me give you another quote. You probably know, she's a fairly well-known public intellectual named Camille Paglia. Mm-hmm. And she has for many years identified as lesbian, although she has now come out as trans. Did you know that? About a year ago.
I did not know that, no.
I guess she was a butch lesbian, and so now she's come out as trans. She's really a guy after all. But here's how she defends being, well, either lesbian or trans. In one of her essays in a book, she puts it this way. On the one hand, she's a bit of an iconoclastic feminist because she does not think sex is just a social construction, which is kind of the lingo today. She says, right. No. Nature made us male and female. In fact, her exact words were, our sexed bodies are designed for reproduction. Isn't that interesting, the word designed?
Yeah. Yes.
But then you say, well, if we were designed for reproduction, if nature made us male and female, how do you defend being lesbian or trans? And here's her exact words. She said, fate, not God, has given us our bodies. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So in other words, her idea is that if our bodies are a product of mindless, purposeless forces, they have no intrinsic purpose that we're morally obligated to respect. They give no moral message. Like the Princeton professor said, they have no meaning at all. They tell us nothing about who we are. And so we have to counter that with, well, actually, science itself shows that living things are structured for a purpose. It's not just the Bible. The science tells us that eyes are for seeing, ears are for hearing, wings are for flying, fins are for swimming. In fact, the entire development of the organism is directed by an inbuilt blueprint or plan, which is the DNA. And so as Christians, we have a positive message again. Our positive message is that you were built for a purpose, that God did create you for a purpose. And what Christians are saying is you will be happier and healthier when you live in harmony with that purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, and I want to come to that in a minute too, in talking about your new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. But I also want to carry the thought forward that I was sharing a moment ago, and you were just talking about. We interviewed James Lindsay a number of months back, and James describes himself as describes himself as an agnostic who's very faith friendly. So we had a great interview, and he's co-author of the book, The Queering of the American Child. And I think it's Logan Lansing, who is the other author. But in it, as I was reading through that, I think every Christian parent needs to read this book and understand that it's not just about, again, when we don't understand what the foundation of the disrupting and the tearing down of the norms around God's design for us as one man for one woman, and out of that relationship in covenant marriage, life can be formed. And, when we start messing with God's design and changing the definitions of marriage and all kinds of things, it's not just trying to be, the messaging is, love love your neighbor, and it's love is love. And we start thinking as Christians, Allie Beth Stuckey, I know you've done an interview with her as well. She wrote a book not that long ago called The Toxic Empathy. And I was just listening to something she shared in a talk last night about the three hallmarks of what toxic empathy looks like, and how culture is taking biblical truth and ideas and grabbing pieces and phrases and using them kind of against a Christian worldview and calling us to something that isn't genuine empathy. It is a toxic empathy. But here's my point. In the book, The Queering of the American Child, what Lansing and Logan Lansing and James Lindsay are talking about is we might think that people are trying to make children gay, lesbian, trans, and I certainly think there's influences out there that are pushing children in those directions. But the idea of queer theory isn't about making someone gay or lesbian or trans per se. It's about the disruption and the destruction of all normalcy, all that's normal, all that is solid and foundational from a heterosexual perspective, heteronormative perspective. And so it really is an anarchy kind of perspective. And when you start to understand that, I think it helps us think more clearly as believers about what's actually going on and how we are approaching this from very, very different foundations today than where we were maybe a number of years ago, where we still believed in general basic morality.
Yeah, although I do think there's often personal motivation too. Judith Butler, who it became sort of the founder of queer theory. Mm-hmm. In one of her books, she acknowledges that after all, we actually all aspire to unity. We want our mind, our emotions, our body, our sexuality to all be in sync with one another, in harmony with one another, which is what the Christian message is, right? That you can be in harmony. Yes. And then she says, but since she's a lesbian, she's not in harmony. Her feelings, her sexual feelings are not in harmony with who she is as a female person. And so she basically says, therefore, there is no harmony. She just throws it all out for everybody else. Nobody else is allowed to have harmony either because right. I don't have it. And I thought, what makes you think you can redefine all of reality based on your own motivation? You want to be seen as natural. She says her whole point is to destroy the idea that any sort of sexuality is natural.
Yes.
Well, but why? Because she doesn't fit it. So there is a personal motivation there as well. For sure. Behind all the highfalutin theories.
Yes.
And I think we should respond to her as a person as well as responding to her ideas. I would like to come back to something you said earlier, if I can. Mm-hmm. You talked about the resurrection of the body. I think we need to recover our own heritage, not just that. By the way, I was talking to a non-Christian the other day, and I said, Apostles' Creed, resurrection of the body, all the way back to the beginning. And my friend said, you're right. Christianity has had a high view of the body all the way back to the beginning. So we need to recover our heritage. The Christian church was born into a culture that had a low view of the physical world and the physical body, just like the secular world does today. But it was for very different reasons. You mentioned the word Gnosticism earlier. Yeah, the early church faced philosophies like Gnosticism and Platonism. We all know the name Plato. And Manichaeism, Augustine was a Manichae. All of these isms said that this world is the realm of death, decay, and destruction, and it is intrinsically evil. And therefore, they taught that, well, Gnosticism taught that there were several levels of deities, and that it was the lowest deity, who was actually an evil god, who created this world. And so in that context, Christianity was nothing short of revolutionary, because it said, no, this world was created by the highest supreme deity, who is a good God, and therefore it is intrinsically good. So the concept of creation taught that this world is good. And then the incarnation taught that that same supreme deity had actually entered into the physical world. That was the biggest scandal in the first century, by the way, is the idea that that God himself would enter into this realm, which they thought was evil.
Yep.
And then what happened? You know, Jesus was executed on a Roman cross, and according to the Gnostics, salvation was described as escape from the physical world. Well, in a sense, he did. He escaped from the physical world, as Gnosticism taught we should do. But what did he do then? He came back in a physical body, the resurrection of the body. Literally, I've read the literature from the ancient pagans who said, why should we believe the resurrection? Who would want to come back to the realm of the body? You know, because they had such a low view of the physical world that to the Greeks, this was not spiritual progress.
Right. Yes.
And that's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians, the resurrection of the body is utter foolishness to the Greeks. And then, of course, at the end of time, you know, a lot of Christians do think that the end is going to be going to heaven, you know, floating around in a spiritual body, in the ether, in the spiritual ether. But what does the scripture teach? It says the ultimate redemption is the new heavens and a new earth. And the resurrection of the body, as you mentioned. So God's not going to scrap the material world as if he made a mistake the first time around. He's going to say he values the material world enough that he's going to restore and renew it. And we will live on that restored, renewed creation. So this is an extremely high view of the physical world. There's nothing like it in any other religion or philosophy. And Christians need to recover a sense of the excitement and, you know, and the joy of having such a high view of this world that God created.
Well, and what you're sharing, I'm just reminded that, you know, from Genesis 3, from the fall, God has from that point forward has been about restoration. I mean, he's been about restoring all things, and it's been, you know, thousands of years in the process, but that is his ultimate aim and goal. And he's even doing that now in the way that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church of God. And how right now it's like being yeast sewn into a lump of dough, that as we are sharing our faith, as we're discipling, you know, that sons and daughters of God are coming into existence all around the globe. So it's, I also love what you're saying too about the church reclaiming the positive and beautiful views of what you're talking about. And one of the reasons for that is we look at the perspective, and of course these perspectives are not necessarily totally accurate, but the problem is that it's believed in most of the surveys that are being done by Barna and Pew and others that the church is negative about everything, that the church is against everything and for very little. And I think we are for a lot, but we're not communicating that well. Oh,
yes. This is what I find when I do a lot of public speaking on my book, Love Thy Body. I have found that the biggest hurdle for Christians to get over is using negative language. You know, it's a sin, it's wrong, it's against the Bible, don't do it, and there's something wrong with you.
Yep.
And so I find that I have to really stress this, that Christians should start with the good news. You know, the good news is not just salvation. The good news is also creation.
Yes.
That we were created in God's image, and that we should respect our body. We should live in harmony with our body. Let me give you a quote. There's a young woman who lived as a lesbian for many years, and now is married and has 2 children. And she wrote an article in which she described the turning point. She said, direct quote, "I came to trust that God had made me female for a reason, and I wanted to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design." That's the model. I want to honor my body by living in accord with the Creator's design. And the pushback I sometimes get is, yeah, but what about sin? The answer to that is sin is like, imagine a beautiful artistic masterpiece, and a child comes with magic marker and scribbles on it. Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's been defaced, but the original beauty still shines through.
Yes.
And that's how we should see creation, including our bodies, is that the original beauty still shines through. Sin does not obliterate. Let's put it this way. Sometimes the Christian message is outlined as creation, fall, redemption. You've heard that breakdown?
Yeah.
Well, fall does not obliterate creation. Our message should start where the Bible starts with us, which is creation and the great value and dignity that we have and the value that our bodies have because of creation. That's where our message should start. Yes, sometimes you're going to have to deal with sin. That's, we don't deny sin, but you start with the message of creation.
Yes.
And honor your body. Live according. Here's another story. This is my favorite one, actually. Is a young man named Sean, who is homosexual. He said he was exclusively attracted to other men from the time he was young, right? Because sometimes when you change, people say, "Oh, you weren't really homosexual.
Yeah,
you were really bi all along." So he's very careful to say no. And the interesting thing about his story is he was raised in a quote unquote gay affirming home and attended a gay affirming church. And so he did not think there was anything really wrong with homosexuality, which also counters the typical stereotype. When people change, they're often said to be driven by guilt, shame, and self-loathing.
Right.
And he says, no, actually, here's how it happened. I came to think that as a man, God had created me, to be in sexual relationship with a woman. And this was quite true, irrespective of whatever feelings I might have. And so he says, I did not try to change my feelings, my sexual feelings, which rarely works. What I did is I decided to accept what I already had, which is a male body, as a good gift from God.
Yes, there you go.
A good gift from God. And he says, eventually my feelings started to change. By the way, he's now married and has 3 children and is a Christian ethics professor in London. But I love the way he put it. He came to see that his body was a good gift from God, and he took his identity from his body and not from his changing feelings, right? Because our feelings can change, and they often do. Yes. So he said, it's much more reliable to take my identity from my body, which is, a good gift from God. That's another phrase I think we should just build into our vocabulary.
Oh, I so agree. Yeah, the program that Melissa and I, my wife and I, were engaged in for probably 20 years through Desert Stream Ministries was called Living Waters. And over and over again, that message in so many ways was reaffirmed of we absolutely, we are and we can become good gifts to the other and to those around us. That was an important message for us to internalize and understand. So critical. I also in what you're talking about with Sean that I think about is feel like sometimes we don't believe that. Well, we discover how we feel. We don't choose how we feel in terms of our attractions. But what I've learned is the attitude of the heart, like Sean and this is true for me and my wife and so many others we know, there had to be a place where we began to align with God's design for us. But then we also needed to, and this is something that he empowers us to do. We can't do it on our own, but we also needed to contend with our anger, discontent, sense of getting ripped off and being made the wrong gender, or, all the attitudes of the heart. We can begin to deal with the attitudes of the heart before our feelings start to change and follow them. So it's not just about changing our outer behavior. That obviously is important, but we have to go deeper than that to allow the Lord and invite him and to cooperate with him in changing the attitude of our heart. And over time, then I found over time, regardless of what the feelings are that pull me in a direction that God's word says is not the way he designed us or is sin or whatever, that those feelings start to shift as I'm allowing the attitude of my heart to change and shift.
Yeah. And in Love Thy Body, I do tell the story of a young man who struggled with gender dysphoria from the time he was quite young. You no doubt know this, but back when we called it transsexualism, it was almost all male, and it usually started quite young. And so Brandon, which is not his real name, was a classic case because even before he was walking, people were commenting on his being very feminine. His babysitter said to his mom, "He's too good to be a boy," by which she meant he was sweet and compliant and gentle and the things we associate with girls. When he was in preschool, every day when his mother picked him up, he was playing with the little girls and not the little boys. And so already in elementary school, he was coming to his parents weeping repeatedly, saying, I don't fit in with boys. But of course, the girls don't really accept me either. So, here's how he put it. I think the way girls do, I feel the way girls do. God should have made me a girl. Mm. And so, not surprisingly, as soon as the internet came around, he was searching for information on sex reassignment surgery. So the question is, what did his parents do? His parents, first of all, they made sure he knew that they loved him just the way he was. In seminary, I had a friend who was a former homosexual, who said, my father kept trying to toughen me up by pushing me into more traditionally masculine things like sports. Yeah. And Brandon's parents didn't do that. They said it's perfectly okay to be a gentle, sensitive, relational boy. It does not mean you're really a girl. It may mean that God has prepared you for one of the helping professions like counselor, psychologist, healthcare worker, so on.
Yep.
And of course, they took him through the gifts of the Spirit and said they're not divided by sex. The gifts of the Spirit and the fruit of the Spirit, neither one is divided into pink boxes and blue boxes.
Right.
And they even took him through the Myers-Briggs personality test, showing that you can be a man or a woman on any side of the spectrum. But then here's how he came. When he finally talked to me about it, he was about 21. By the way, most people do grow out. Most children outgrow their gender dysphoria in puberty with the rush of hormones, but he didn't. His was pretty severe. So he was about 21, 22, one of the last times I talked to him about it. And at that time, he was saying, I'm still a girl on the inside. And then he watched a video. There's a TED Talk by a cardiologist. And the main line from the TED Talk is, every cell has a sex. Every cell, has the DNA for either male or female. And so obviously you cannot change every cell in your body. So he finally decided it was scientifically impossible to change your sex. In fact, here's how he put it. In talking to me, he said, a person is not a computer disk that you can erase and start over again. I thought that was a cute analogy. But the point is that, he will probably always be on the more sensitive, gentle side of the masculine spectrum. But he's finally come to accept who he is as a good gift from God, to use that phrase again. And I agree with you. It took years and years, and it was very painful. It's very painful to feel out of step with the masculine stereotypes. He didn't fit the John Wayne masculinity image. And you know what he told me? He said the most difficult places, Christian places, like Christian schools, Christian churches, because we're trying so hard to stand against the secular culture with its androgyny, with its denial of the male-female binary. He said, we're almost trying too hard. And so he found the most rigid masculine stereotypes in the church. Yeah. Which is something we can think about in terms of how we as Christians reach out to these young people. We should realize that anyone who doesn't fit the stereotype these days is going to be pressured. I don't know if you have kids this age, but kids in school say, I have a niece who's 11. She said, the kids are constantly asking each other, are you gay? Are you trans? Yep. It's constant. Another niece on the other side of the family got pressured into, she did not come from a Christian family. And when she started a new school, her classmates said, you're a lesbian. She said, no, I'm not. Yes, you are. I don't know why they decided that, but they put a lot of pressure on it. And she decided, well, I guess they're right. Yeah. She went through a lesbian stage. She went through a trans stage. Now she's a lesbian again. And anyway, and she's only 14. So
it's so sad. Those labels have such huge power. Yep. And
so as Christians, I think we really need to proactively reach out to young people who don't fit the gender stereotypes, because they will experience pressure both from school and from their and from their peers.
Yes.
I think we should have a special make effort to reach out to kids who are gender nonconforming.
Yeah, I agree. And so much of what you were describing about this other young man was, Brandon, I think you said, is the when he was saying, I feel like I should have been made a girl. That's exactly. I mean, I felt that. Now and I went through a phase of really leaning into that for a while. Now that desisted, but same-sex attraction was very persistent and very intense, throughout. But that feeling of I fit in with girls, I think like girls, I don't want to be around the boys. It doesn't feel safe to be around the boys. All those kind of things, and they don't want me around anyway. So what difference does it make? All that stuff was true at the time, and it's easy to interpret to get an interpretation, a wrong interpretation in our minds, and the labels. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. Well, it's the other way around. We heal from the sticks and the stones, right? But eventually it's those labels that can last for decades of time. But I agree with what you're saying in terms of understanding, the church understanding that if we don't step in to lives that are impacted this way, gender nonconforming or confusion around identity, then they are going to be pressured. And the pressure is going to be such if the church doesn't rise up to be the church in these kids' lives, then they may buckle to that pressure. But I would say that's true. But even in front of that, we need to understand that young people going through genuine either gender dysphoria or same-sex attraction or something that doesn't feel like it conforms or fits in are really experiencing incredible and pretty intense ongoing chronic emotional pain. And that alone should compel us as the church to want to lean in, and rather than get a boy to man up or a girl to, grab the lipstick and become a Barbie or something. I mean, we need to get realistic about helping to them as leaders, as youth pastors or people running a small group, however we are connected to young people, really entering in and understanding. Again, this comes back to shepherding the heart more than just trying to change outer behavior. Yeah.
Yes, that's a good point. Since I knew Brandon from the time he was quite young, I had the chance to pray with him and suffer alongside. Compassion. Compassion means to suffer with.
Yes.
It was a lot more painful than you would know from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
We need people who will fight this on the political level. That's great. Yep. Who will fight for, what's being taught in the schools, or fight for laws that are being passed. Several states now have laws against gender surgery on minors, for example.
Yes.
And many European countries also now have laws against gender surgery. So we need people who can do that sort of public-facing stuff. But then we need people who know from the inside how painful these things can be, and who have more of the nurturing and the pastoral side. Because
yes,
I don't know that I would have ever realized how painful gender dysphoria is if I hadn't, walked closely alongside Brandon for all those years.
Yes,
it was. I can hardly even talk about it without tearing up because it was so difficult. So I think your point is very well taken. We have to make sure that we're walking alongside people as well, and realizing how difficult and painful it is. We shouldn't be surprised, because if your life is not fitting with biblical design, it is going to be painful. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have compassion for the people who are kind of caught there.
Yep. Well, we all have our stories of brokenness of one thing or another because of the world we live in. And when we start hearing stories, it's amazing how our hearts can melt, and we can and not melt, and it shouldn't melt toward affirmation of things that are not healthy or sinful, but can melt toward having genuine compassion, coming alongside, having genuine compassion for what a person is wrestling with, and helping to be, a bumper in the bowling alley lane that helps keep them out of the gutter and guides them toward Jesus and toward the Father. I wanted to hit on a couple things really quickly before we wrap up, if possible. I remember being maybe a year and a half ago or so, I think it was at the NRB. I was in an audience, and you were there having a panel discussion, and And one of the things that you talked about, I think your book had just your most recent book, The Toxic War on Masculinity, had just come out. And you were talking about a study, and you and I were talking about this up in Portland as well, but you were talking about a study that had come out. And I think I referenced the wrong one, so I won't mention it now. You can just say it. That had come out that talked about the incredible value of a father's faith that is lived out in a way that's salient, not just, and this goes to some stuff that you unpacked that I've not read anywhere in the Toxic War on Masculinity, of how you took the data and highlighted not just the kind of average Christian dude or somebody that says they're a Christian, but you separated out the nominal Christian from an authentic Christian. I don't think I'm saying that. And you talked about how the nominal Christian is actually more abusive and worse in many ways than the secular man, but how the truly committed and faithful Christian is far and above, more faithful to his wife, and more loving toward his children, etc. And so I've never seen those numbers. They're always dumped together in popular media, and the idea of the patriarchy and men that lead, that's all bad. Would you touch on those things that I know just threw a bunch at you, but what that piece that you shared in that panel discussion, if you recall what that was about, that a father's faith has such impact on children staying in the faith and really getting grounded in their relationship with Jesus.
Yeah, those are two separate studies. So I'll address the fathers first. And I should warn you that there was an earlier study that was not valid. And so people always say, "Oh, that one's been that study's been
debunked,
discredited." No, actually, no, that was an earlier one. This one has not been discredited. So just let me tell you, in case anyone asks you. It was a 35-year longitudinal study that won several awards because it was such a good study. And it was specifically on how parents pass along their religious convictions. And it came up with, and Benston was the name of the guy, Benston. And it has some generic title like Families and Faith. But if you look in my book, you'll find the footnote, Benston. He found two interesting things. Number one, yes, the father mattered more than the mother. For passing on the religious convictions, the father mattered more than the mother. And of course, mothers matter, but in terms of the sheer numbers. In fact, I heard, what was his name? Someone from Harvard University was on a podcast just a few days ago, and he said that it's 40 percentage points difference in terms of the father's impact and the mother's impact. Now, I haven't followed up on that study yet because I just heard it, but 40 percentage points difference between the father's impact. When I tell this to my students, the female students always say, "Well, that's not fair." And I say, "Well, it's a fact." So fathers have a greater influence, whether they want to or not. Yes. But the second thing that this study found was the relationship with the father has to be warm, close, and loving. If the father is a pillar of the church, a moral exemplar, has perfect theology, but his children perceive him as cold, distant, and authoritarian, they will not follow. They will not follow that father into the faith. And what's interesting is that another study was done on just the more secular question of how do you produce masculine sons? And there's a whole book on this study, too. And the conclusion was the same. It said whether the father is more stereotypically macho or not, whether he's more gentle, doesn't make any difference. What matters is the quality of the relationship between the father and the son. If it's a warm, close, loving relationship, the son will end up with a stable, secure, healthy sense of masculinity. So from the secular side and the Christian side, they're both finding the same thing.
Yes.
But then you talked about the authentic Christian versus a nominal Christian, and that's a very different set of studies. The biggest one was done by Brad Wilcox at the University of Virginia. And what he found, they're responding partly to the secular narrative, the media narrative that if you hold to any notion of male headship in the home, this will turn men into overbearing, tyrannical, oppressive patriarchs. Well, that's actually an empirical question. Does it? Does it turn them into these horrible people? And so the social scientists were listening and saying, "Where's your evidence? You're making these accusations, but where's your data?" And so they went out and did the studies. I quote about a dozen studies in my book. And they found that the actual facts completely explode the media narrative. As you mentioned earlier, the men who are authentic, committed, and go to church regularly. I'll give you the stats. Their wives report the highest level of happiness. And by the way, yes, they do interview the wives separately, which is
yes, important.
So it's the wives reporting a higher level of happiness. They do spend more time with their children, 3.5 more hours per week than secular men. They have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples. And they actually have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. So Brad Wilcox, the sociologist I mentioned earlier, to give you a sense of his stature, he gets published in places like the New York Times. So in a New York Times article, let me give you the exact quote. He said, in fact, let me look at it to make sure I get your exact quote. It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend religious services regularly with their husbands have high-quality marriages. So this is not a pep talk from some religious leader. This is hard empirical evidence. These are facts that we should be confident in bringing both into the church and into the public realm. And then the first pushback I always get is what you also alluded to already, which is, haven't we all heard that Christian couples divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture? And so it wasn't me who made the distinction. It was the researchers. They went back to the data and they made that distinction between men who are authentic and attend church regularly versus nominal men. And by the way, my students don't even know what nominal means. So I have to tell them NOM, the root, is Latin for name. So it means in name only. So in these large surveys, these are men who might check, say, the Baptist box, but it's mostly cultural family background. And they test out shockingly different. This is what's so surprising. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness.
Yes.
They spend the least amount of time with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular couples. And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any group in America. Brad Wilcox wrote an article on it for Christianity Today, and his summary was, the most violent husbands in America are nominal evangelical Protestant men who attend church rarely, if at all. So this is what we're up against, a Christian ministry like yours, or the church as a whole. How can we, on the one hand, encourage the men who are doing well, that in fact, living by God's design.
Yes.
The empirical evidence shows that they have happier, healthier marriages and families. And the churches are not getting this message yet, by the way. If you read my book, if you're an EndNote reader, I try to get my students to all read EndNotes. Yes. You will have noticed that all of my EndNotes are to academic journal articles. This is not in the public arena yet. So churches need to, on the one hand, learn to support and encourage men who are doing well. One of my graduate students is the head of a women's ministry at a very large megachurch here in the Houston area. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. So it's time to stop scolding, bring this data into the churches to encourage men that when they live God's way, they are, it's empirically verified that they are happier and healthier. And then how do we reach out to the nominals? So these are guys who are claiming an evangelical identity, but who are, in fact, absorbing the secular script for masculinity.
Yes.
They have a secular mindset. And when you put the two together, surprisingly, they end up being worse than secular men. In other words, they take the secular idea of masculinity, but they sort of put a Christian frosting on the layer of the cake. They say things like, well, I have religious justification for mistreating my wife. She wouldn't do what I said, so I had to put her in her place. Yep. They will use a Christian justification and then end up actually being worse than secular men.
Yes. Yeah, in so many cases, their hearts really haven't been changed, but they've gotten just enough of some basic ideas, wives submit to your husbands or something like that, and they're not even looking at the scriptures that say submit to one another. They're just grabbing pieces and justifying it. And so therefore it makes sense that they would be worse than not just truly devoted followers of Christ, men, but also than the secular man. So, and when the world hears the predominant message that's going out that wraps all of this in the nominal Christian perspective and the data that flows out of that, what's to be aspired to? I mean, we've got young men, and one of the reasons Jordan Peterson is such a high profile individual, and I love so much of what he teaches. So much of it's very good. He's not a follower of Christ, but so much of it, yet anyway, so much of it is very good. But you also have people like Andrew Tate out there spewing all kinds of trash and garbage, and yet young men are looking for someone who's going to stand up and say, being a young man isn't toxic, in and of itself. It isn't bad just because you are in your skin and you were made the way that you were made. They're looking for some kind of definition. Well, what an opportunity for the church to actually focus on some of these studies that have come out that talk about the goodness and wholesomeness of those who are really following Christ, the way that they're loving their wives, the way they're loving their children, and of course imperfectly, but doing pretty darn well, better than any others in the culture. That message needs to be something that we're talking a lot about.
Yeah, I got an email from a former graduate student who now teaches high school. And she said, all of my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook.
Yeah.
I said, where do you teach? At a classical Christian school.
Oof.
Yeah. So here's what we have to do is we have to help young men form a critical grid. It's not enough to teach them the biblical teaching, although that's a good place to start, but they also need a critical grid so they recognize the secular script for masculinity.
Yes. When
it comes to them. Let me give you just one example. I give several examples of where the secular script, how it emerged, how it grew over time in my book. But the stage that I like to focus on especially is, again, the rise of Darwinian evolution. This is another way that it's had tremendous social impact. Let me give you a quote. Social Darwinists said, in the struggle for survival, the men who came out on top were ruthless, brutal, savage, barbarian, and predatory. And even today, there's a best-selling book, so it's had a lot of impact, called The Moral Animal. And the author says, human males are by nature oppressive, possessive, flesh-obsessed pigs. Giving them advice on successful marriage is like offering Vikings a free booklet on how not to pillage. I thought, well, how does he get away with such a negative view? But let me give you one more. This is the book called Men in Marriage. Men are by nature violent, sexually predatory, and irresponsible. Their deepest yearning is not for a wife and family, but for the motorbike and the open road. The male group escape to a primal mode of predatory and immediate gratification. So do you see where the Andrew Tate phenomenon is coming from?
Sure.
Intellectuals have been building it for decades, ever since the rise of Darwin, well, even before, but Darwin gave them, extra ammo in terms of crafting a very negative view of masculinity. So when men turn to the secular world, this is the message they're getting. And so we have to, this is where my background as an apologist comes in, right? I want to help people argue against the secular messages that are creeping in if people don't have a critical grid in place.
Yes. Well, and to just wrap up, I love all that you shared. I could talk to you forever, obviously, but and we do need to, the front door of change comes from education and getting accurate and well-grounded information, certainly biblical information, but also solid scientific information out to and teaching it and putting it forward. But there's also such a critical need, and it's I think one of the reasons that fathers are so important in the lives of children is that it's not just about the things that are taught. That's very important, but more is caught than taught. The idea of walking with somebody, being with somebody, getting time with someone, as you said earlier, children, boys especially, that feel like their fathers are warm and affectionate and loving and approachable. That is so critical in terms of establishing the being able to live out in the give and take of what it looks like to kind of do life on life discipleship within the home. But also I've learned, my boys are 14 and 16, so they are young, but I love that role I get to play in their life. But I've also learned that I am also, and this is just crazy to me, it's only God that could do this, that from my background, that I still get to be a spiritual father to so many men. I mean, that's kind of crazy to me. And I love the idea that somehow God can crack me open and pour something out into not just in one experience, but over time in the life of young men who have not maybe been fathered as well, or are longing for some kind of mentor to come along and not just tell them what's true and give and point to scripture and point to other things, and they can learn that themselves as well. But there's something about the relationship with one another that can reinforce and really put meat on the bones of some of these truths. I just think that's so essential. We need to lean into both aspects, I think, in the church.
Yeah, I am often asked, what about boys who don't have fathers? Because I stress the importance of fathers.
Yes.
But studies have shown that father substitutes can have a huge impact. So that was encouraging to me when I read this.
Yes.
By the way, the numbers were up against 40% of American children are growing up apart from their natural father. And some have father substitutes, but the majority do not. Majority are growing up with just mothers in the home. So this is a big problem the church does need to talk about. But studies have found that fathers substitutes grandparents first, not surprisingly, but also uncles and other relatives, older brothers, church youth pastors, coaches, teachers. All of these can have a huge impact. And so there's plenty of work for all of us.
Yes.
We can all have something to do. One of my goals in my book is to encourage churches to start ministries to fatherless boys. That's what I would like to see churches start ministries to fatherless boys. I think men shape the culture in such a dramatic way that bringing up boys to become biblically oriented men is such a huge project, and the church has not really been focused on that.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us for the Love and Truth Network podcast. We hope that the stories and insights shared have ignited in you a sense of God's powerful love for you and given you encouragement for your own journey toward relational and sexual wholeness. Remember, transformation is absolutely possible when rooted in grace, truth, and authentic biblical community. Subscribe today, share with a friend, share with your pastor, and we look forward to seeing you in our next Love and Truth Network podcast.